Ahoy! This is Ron Gabaldon. I'm the guy that's been reading Kurt Vonnegut novels into a YouTube channel. This is the space that I do it in. It's a closet. I just wanted to give folks a heads up that there may be a few things that people might find objectionable in this next book that I'll be reading. The first is the mention of black men as servants in the prologue. The second is there's a mention of Down syndrome as mongoloidism. The third is the concept of slavery is brought up intermittently throughout the book. Other than that, I just wanted to thank everyone for their support, for their comments, for subscribing. It's been a very interesting experience for me to reread all of these novels, having read them all in my 20s some time ago, and so I find I get more out of them now than I did then. So I hope you're enjoying it as well, and please continue to enjoy them. There's going to be a lot more of it. I also would like to remind everyone that I still have books on Audible.com by Frank J Edler, Death Gets a Book, A Death in Toledo, Cat Coin, A Fictional History of a Cryptocurrency, and I have a new book out called Haunted Hamburger House, which is on DNT NFTs, and I'll put links to all of those down below. Other than that, let's Vonnegut at it. Slapstick by Kurt Vonnegut, Part 1, Prologue and Chapters 1 through 5, read by Ron Gabaldon. Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized. Romeo. Prologue. This is the closest I will ever come to writing an autobiography. I have called it slapstick because it is grotesque situational poetry, like the slapstick film comedies, especially those of Laurel and Hardy of long ago. It is about what life feels like to me. There are all of these tests of my limited agility and intelligence. They go on and on. The fundamental joke with Laurel and Hardy, it seems to me, was that they did their very best with every test. They never failed to bargain in good faith with their destinies, and were screamingly adorable and funny on that account. There was very little love in their films. There was often the situational poetry of marriage, which was something else again. It was yet another test, with comical possibilities, provided that everybody submitted to it in good faith. Love was never at issue, and perhaps because I was so perpetually intoxicated and instructed by Laurel and Hardy during my childhood in the Great Depression, I find it natural to discuss life without ever mentioning love. It does not seem important to me. What does seem important? Bargaining in good faith with destiny. I have had some experiences with love, or think I have anyway, although the ones I have liked best could easily be described as common decency. I treated somebody well for a little while, or maybe even for a tremendously long time, and that person treated me well in turn. Love need not have had anything to do with it. Also, I cannot distinguish between the love I have for people and the love I have for dogs. When a child, and not watching comedians on film or listening to comedians on the radio, I used to spend a lot of time rolling around on rugs with uncritically affectionate dogs we had. And I still do a lot of that. The dogs become tired and confused and embarrassed long before I do. I could go on forever. Hi-ho. One time, on his 21st birthday, one of my 3 adopted sons, who was about to leave for the Peace Corps in the Amazon rainforest, said to me, "You know, you've never hugged me." So I hugged him. We hugged each other. It was very nice. It was like rolling around on a rug with a Great Dane we used to have. Love is where you find it. I think it is foolish to go looking for it, and I think it can often be poisonous. I wish that people who are conveniently supposed to love each other would say to each other when they fight, "Please, a little less love and a little more common decency." My longest experience with common decency surely has been with my older brother, my only brother, Bernard, who is an atmospheric scientist in the State University of New York at Albany. He is a widower, raising 2 young sons all by himself. He does it well. He has 3 grown-up sons besides. We were given very different sorts of minds at birth. Bernard could never be a writer. I could never be a scientist. And since we make our livings with our minds, we tend to think of them as gadgets, separate from our awarenesses, from our central selves. We have hugged each other maybe 3 or 4 times. On birthdays very likely, and clumsily. We have never hugged in moments of grief. The minds we have been given enjoy the same sorts of jokes at any rate. Mark Twain stuff, Laurel and Hardy stuff. They are equally disorderly, too. Here is an anecdote about my brother, which, with minor variations, could be told truthfully about me. Bernard worked for the General Electric Research Laboratory in Schenectady, New York for a while, where he discovered that silver iodide could precipitate certain sorts of clouds as snow or rain. His laboratory was a sensational mess, however, where a clumsy stranger could die in 1,000 different ways, depending on where he stumbled. The company had a safety officer who nearly swooned when he saw this jungle of deadfalls and snares and hair-trigger booby traps. He bawled out my brother. My brother said this to him, tapping his own forehead with his fingertips. "If you think this laboratory is bad, you should see what it's like in here." And so on. I told my brother one time that whenever I did repair work around the house, I lost all my tools before I could finish the job. "You're lucky," he said. "I always lose whatever I'm working on." We laughed. But because of the sorts of minds we were given at birth, and in spite of their disorderliness, Bernard and I belong to artificial extended families which allow us to claim relatives all over the world. He is a brother to scientists everywhere, and I am a brother to writers everywhere. This is amusing and comforting to both of us. It is nice. It is lucky, too, for human beings need all the relatives they can get, as possible donors or receivers not necessarily of love, but of common decency. When we were children in Indianapolis, Indiana, it appeared that we would always have an extended family of genuine relatives there. Our parents and grandparents, after all, had grown up there with shoals of siblings and cousins and uncles and aunts. Yes, and their relatives were all cultivated and gentle and prosperous, and spoke German and English gracefully. They were all religious skeptics, by the way. They might roam the wide world over when they were young, and often have wonderful adventures, but they were all told sooner or later that it was time for them to come home to Indianapolis and to settle down. They invariably obeyed, because they had so many relatives there. There were good things to inherit, too, of course. Sane businesses, comfortable homes, and faithful servants, growing mountains of china and crystal and silverware, reputations for honest dealing, cottages on Lake Maxinkuckee, along whose eastern shore my family once owned a village of summer homes. But the delight the family took in itself was permanently crippled, I think, by the sudden American hatred for all things German, which unsheathed itself when this country entered the First World War, 5 years before I was born. Children in our family were no longer taught German. Neither were they encouraged to admire German music or literature or art or science. My brother and sister and I were raised as though Germany were as foreign to us as Paraguay. We were deprived of Europe, except for what we might learn of it at school. We lost thousands of years in a very short time, and then tens of thousands of American dollars after that, and the summer cottages and so on. And our family became a lot less interesting, especially to itself. So, by the time the Great Depression and a Second World War were over, it was easy for my brother and my sister and me to wander away from Indianapolis. And of all the relatives we left behind, not one could think of a reason why we should come home again. We didn't belong anywhere in particular anymore. We were interchangeable parts in the American machine. Yes, and Indianapolis, which had once had a way of speaking English all its own, and jokes and legends and poets, and villains and heroes all its own, and galleries for its own artists, had itself become an interchangeable part in the American machine. It was just another someplace where automobiles lived, with a symphony orchestra and all, and a racetrack. Hi-ho. My brother and I still go back for funerals, of course. We went back last July for the funeral of our Uncle Alex Vonnegut, the younger brother of our late father, almost the last of our old-style relatives, of the Native American patriots who did not fear God, and who had souls that were European. He was 87 years old. He was childless. He was a graduate of Harvard. He was a retired life insurance agent. He was a co-founder of the Indianapolis chapter of Alcoholics Anonymous. His obituary in the Indianapolis Star said that he himself was not an alcoholic. This denial was at least partly a nice Nellyism from the past, I think. He used to drink, I know, although alcohol never seriously damaged his work or made him wild, and then he stopped cold. And he surely must have introduced himself at meetings of AA, as all members must, with his name, followed by this brave confession: I'm an alcoholic. Yes, and the paper's genteel denial of his ever having had trouble with alcohol had the old-fashioned intent of preserving from taint all the rest of us who had had the same last name. We would all have a harder time making good Indianapolis marriages or getting good Indianapolis jobs if it were known for certain that we had had relatives who were once drunkards, or who, like my mother and my son, had gone at least temporarily insane. It was even a secret that my paternal grandmother died of cancer. Think of that. At any rate, if Uncle Alex, the atheist, found himself standing before St. Peter and the pearly gates after he died, I am certain he introduced himself as follows: My name is Alex Vonnegut. I'm an alcoholic. Good for him. I will guess, too, that it was loneliness as much as it was a dread of alcoholic poisoning which shepherded him into AA. As his relatives died off or wandered away, or simply became interchangeable parts in the American machine, he went looking for new brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces and uncles and aunts and so on, which he found in AA. When I was a child, he used to tell me what to read, and then make sure I'd read it. It used to amuse him to take me on visits to relatives I'd never known I had. He told me one time that he had been an American spy in Baltimore during the First World War, befriending German Americans there. His assignment was to detect enemy agents. He detected nothing, for there was nothing to detect. He told me, too, that he was an investigator of graft in New York City for a little while, before his parents told him it was time to come home and settle down. He uncovered a scandal involving large expenditures for the maintenance of Grant's tomb, which required very little maintenance indeed. Hi-ho. I received the news of his death over a white push-button telephone in my house, in that part of Manhattan known as Turtle Bay. There was a philodendron nearby. I am still not clear how I got here. There are no turtles. There is no bay. Perhaps I am the turtle, able to live simply anywhere, even underwater for short periods, with my home on my back. So I called my brother in Albany. He was about to turn 60. I was 52. We were certainly no spring chickens. But Bernard still played the part of an older brother. It was he who got us our seats on Transworld Airlines, and our car at the Indianapolis airport, and our double room with twin beds at a Ramada Inn. The funeral itself, like the funerals of our parents and so many other close relatives, was as blankly secular, as vacant of ideas about God or the afterlife, or even about Indianapolis, as our Ramada Inn. So my brother and I strapped ourselves into a jet-propelled airplane bound from New York City to Indianapolis. I sat on the aisle, Bernard took the window seat since he was an atmospheric scientist, since clouds had so much more to say to him than they did to me. We were both over 6 feet tall. We still had most of our hair, which was brown. We had identical mustaches, duplicates of our late father's mustache. We were harmless looking. We were a couple of nice old Andy Gumps. There was an empty seat between us, which was spooky poetry. It could have been a seat for our sister, Alice, whose age was halfway between mine and Bernard's. She wasn't in that seat, and on her way to her beloved Uncle Alex's funeral, for she had died among strangers in New Jersey of cancer at the age of 41. "Soap opera," she said to my brother and me one time when discussing her own impending death. She would be leaving 4 young boys behind, without any mother. "Slapstick," she said. Hi-ho. She spent the last day of her life in a hospital. The doctors and nurses said she could smoke and drink as much as she pleased, and eat whatever she pleased. My brother and I paid her a call. It was hard for her to breathe. She had been as tall as we were at one time, which was very embarrassing to her, since she was a woman. Her posture had always been bad, because of her embarrassment. Now she had a posture like a question mark. She coughed. She laughed. She made a couple of jokes, which I don't remember now. Then she sent us away. "Don't look back," she said. So we didn't. She died at about the same time of day that Uncle Alex died, an hour or 2 after the sun went down. And hers would have been an unremarkable death statistically if it were not for one detail, which was this. Her healthy husband, James Carmalt Adams, the editor of a trade journal for purchasing agents, which he put together in a cubicle on Wall Street, had died 2 mornings before on The Broker's Special, the only train in American railroading history to hurl itself off an open drawbridge. Think of that. This really happened. Bernard and I did not tell Alice about what had happened to her husband, who was supposed to take full charge of the children after she died. But she found out about it anyway. An ambulatory female patient gave her a copy of the New York Daily News. The front page headline was about the dive of the train. Yes, and there was a list of the dead and missing inside. Since Alice had never received any religious instruction, and since she had led a blameless life, she never thought of her awful luck as being anything but accidents in a very busy place. Good for her. Exhaustion, yes, and deep money worries, too, made her say toward the end that she guessed that she wasn't really very good at life. Then again, neither were Laurel and Hardy. My brother and I had already taken over her household. After she died, her 3 oldest sons, who were between the ages of 8 and 14, held a meeting, which no grown-ups could attend. Then they came out and asked that we honor their only 2 requirements, that they remain together and that they keep their 2 dogs. The youngest child, who was not at the meeting, was a baby only a year old or so. From then on, the 3 oldest were raised by me and my wife, Jane Cox Vonnegut, along with our own 3 children on Cape Cod. The baby, who lived with us for a while, was adopted by a first cousin of their father, who is now a judge in Birmingham, Alabama. So be it. The 3 oldest kept their dogs. I remember now what one of her sons, who is named Kurt like my father and me, asked me as we drove from New Jersey to Cape Cod with the 2 dogs in back. He was about 8. We were going from south to north, so where we were going was up to him. There were just the 2 of us. His brothers had gone ahead. "Are the kids up there nice?" he said. "Yes, they are," I replied. He is an airline pilot now. They are all something other than children now. One of them is a goat farmer on a mountaintop in Jamaica. He has made come true a dream of our sisters, to live far from the madness of cities with animals for friends. He has no telephone or electricity. He is desperately dependent on rainfall. He is a ruined man if it does not rain. The 2 dogs have died of old age. I used to roll around with them on rugs for hours on end, until they were all pooped out. Yes, and our sister's sons are candid now about a creepy business which used to worry them a lot. They cannot find their mother or their father in their memories anywhere. Not anywhere. The goat farmer, whose name is James Carmalt Adams, Jr., said this about it to me, tapping his forehead with his fingertips. It isn't the museum it should be. The museums in children's minds, I think, automatically empty themselves in times of utmost horror to protect the children from eternal grief. For my own part, though, it would have been catastrophic if I had forgotten my sister at once. I had never told her so, but she was the person I had always written for. She was the secret of whatever artistic unity I had ever achieved. She was the secret of my technique. Any creation which has any wholeness or harmoniousness, I suspect, was made by an artist or inventor with an audience of one in mind. Yes, and she was nice enough, or nature was nice enough, to allow me to feel her presence for a number of years after she died, to let me go on writing for her. But then she began to fade away, perhaps because she had more important business elsewhere. Be that as it may, she had vanished entirely as my audience by the time my Uncle Alex died. So the seat between my brother and me on the airplane seemed especially vacant to me. I filled it as best I could, with that morning's issue of the New York Times. While my brother and I waited for the plane to take off for Indianapolis, he made me a present of a joke by Mark Twain, about an opera Twain had seen in Italy. Twain said that he hadn't heard anything like it, quote, since the orphanage burned down, end quote. We laughed. He asked me politely how my work was going. I think he respects but is baffled by my work. I said that I was sick of it, but that I had always been sick of it. I told him a remark which I had heard attributed to the writer Renata Adler, who hates writing, that a writer was a person who hated writing. I told him, too, what my agent, Max Wilkinson, wrote to me after I complained again about what a disagreeable profession I had. This was it. Dear Kurt, I never knew a blacksmith who was in love with his anvil. We laughed again, but I think the joke was partly lost on my brother. His life has been an unending honeymoon with his anvil. I told him that I had been going to operas recently, and that the set for the first act of Tosca had looked exactly like the interior of Union Station in Indianapolis to me. While the actual opera was going on, I said, I daydreamed about putting track numbers on the archways of the set, and passing out bells and whistles to the orchestra, and staging an opera about Indianapolis during the age of the Iron Horse. People from our great-grandfather's generation would mingle with our own when we were young, I said. And all the generations in between. Arrivals and departures would be announced. Uncle Alex would leave for his job as a spy in Baltimore. You would come home from your freshman year at MIT. There would be shoals of relatives, I said, watching the travelers come and go, and black men to carry the luggage and shine the shoes. Every so often in my opera, I said, the stage would turn mud-colored with uniforms. That would be a war. And then it would clear up again. After the plane took off, my brother showed me a piece of scientific apparatus which he had brought along. It was a photoelectric cell connected to a small tape recorder. He aimed the electric eye at clouds. It perceived lightning flashes which were invisible to us in the dazzle of daytime. The secret flashes were recorded as clicks by the recorder. We could also hear the clicks as they happened, on a tiny earphone. There's a hot one, my brother announced. He indicated a distant cumulus cloud, a seeming Pike's Peak of whipped cream. He let me listen to the clicks. There were 2 quick ones, then some silence, then 3 quick ones, then silence again. How far away is that cloud? I asked him. Oh, 100 miles, maybe, he said. I thought it was beautiful that my big brother could detect secrets so simply from so far away. I lit a cigarette. Bernard doesn't smoke anymore because it is so important that he live a good while longer. He still has 2 little boys to raise. Yes, and while my big brother meditated about clouds, the mind I was given daydreamed the story in this book. It is about desolated cities and spiritual cannibalism, and incest, and loneliness, and lovelessness, and death, and so on. It depicts myself and my beautiful sister as monsters, and so on. It is only natural since I dreamed it on the way to a funeral. It is about this terribly old man in the ruins of Manhattan, you see, where almost everyone has been killed by a mysterious disease called the Green Death. He lives there with his illiterate, rickety, pregnant little granddaughter, Melody. Who is he really? I guess he is myself, experimenting with being old. Who is Melody? I thought for a while that she was all that remained of my memory of my sister. I now believe that she is what I feel to be, when I experiment with old age, all that is left of my optimistic imagination, of my creativeness. Hi-ho. The old man is writing his autobiography. He begins it with words which my late Uncle Alex told me one time should be used by religious skeptics as a prelude to their nightly prayers. These are the words, "To whom it may concern." Chapter 1. To whom it may concern. It is springtime. It is late afternoon. Smoke from a cooking fire on the terrazzo floor of the lobby of the Empire State Building on the Island of Death floats out over the ailanthus jungle which 34th Street has become. The pavement on the floor of the jungle is all crinkum-crankum heaved this way and that by frost heaves and roots. There is a small clearing in the jungle. A blue-eyed, lantern-jawed old white man who is 2 meters tall and 100 years old sits in the clearing on what was once the back seat of a taxicab. I am that man. My name is Dr. Wilbur Daffodil-11 Swain. I am barefoot. I wear a purple toga made from draperies found in the ruins of the Americana Hotel. I am a former president of the United States of America. I was the final president, the tallest president, and the only one ever to have been divorced while occupying the White House. I inhabit the first floor of the Empire State Building with my 16-year-old granddaughter, who is Melody Oriole II von Peterswald, and with her lover, Isidore Raspberry 19 Cohen. The 3 of us have the building all to ourselves. Our nearest neighbor is 1.5 kilometers away. I have just heard one of her roosters crow. Our nearest neighbor is Vera Chipmunk 5 Zappa, a woman who loves life and is better at it than anyone I ever knew. She is a strong and warm-hearted and hard-working farmer in her early 60s. She is built like a fire plug. She has slaves whom she treats very well, and she and the slaves raise cattle and pigs and chickens and goats and corn and wheat and vegetables and fruits and grapes along the shores of the East River. They have a windmill for grinding grain, and a still for making brandy, and a smokehouse, and on and on. Vera, I told her the other day, if you would only write us a new Declaration of Independence, you would be the Thomas Jefferson of modern times. I write this book on the stationery of the Continental Driving School, 3 boxes of which Melody and Isidore found in a closet on the 64th floor of our home. They also found a gross of ballpoint pens. Visitors from the mainland are rare. The bridges are down. The tunnels are crushed, and boats will not come near us for fear of the plague peculiar to this island, which is called the Green Death. And it is that plague which has earned Manhattan the sobriquet, the Island of Death. Hi-ho. It is a thing I often say these days. Hi-ho. It is a kind of senile hiccup. I have lived too long. Hi-ho. The gravity is very light today. I have an erection as a result of that. All males have erections on days like this. They are automatic consequences of near weightlessness. They have little to do with eroticism in most cases, and nothing to do with it in the life of a man my age. They are hydraulic experiences, the results of confused plumbing and little more. Hi-ho. The gravity is so light today that I feel as though I might scamper to the top of the Empire State Building with a manhole cover and fling it into New Jersey. That would surely be an improvement on George Washington sailing a silver dollar across the Rappahannock. And yet some people insist that there is no such thing as progress. I am sometimes called the King of Candlesticks, because I own more than 1,000 candlesticks. But I am fonder of my middle name, which is Daffodil-11, and I have written a poem about it, and about life itself, of course. I was those seeds. I am this meat. This meat hates pain. This meat must eat. This meat must sleep. This meat must dream. This meat must laugh. This meat must scream. But when, as meat, it's had its fill, please plant it as a daffodil. And who will read all this? God knows. Not Melody or Isidore, surely. Like all the other young people on the island, they can neither read nor write. They have no curiosity about the human past or about what life may have been like on the mainland. As far as they are concerned, the most glorious accomplishment of the people who inhabited this island so teemingly was to die, so we could have it all to ourselves. I asked them the other evening to name the 3 most important human beings in history. They protested that the question made no sense to them. I insisted that they put their heads together anyway and give me some sort of answer, which they did. They were very sulky about the exercise. It was painful to them. They finally came up with an answer. Melody does most of the talking for them, and this is what she said in all seriousness. You and Jesus Christ and Santa Claus. Hi-ho. When I do not ask them questions, they are happy as clams. They hope to become slaves of Vera Chipmunk 5 Zappa one day. That is okay with me. Chapter 2. And I really will try to stop writing hi-ho all the time. Hi-ho. I was born right here in New York City. I was not then a daffodil. I was christened Wilbur Rockefeller Swain. I was not alone, moreover. I had a dizygotic twin, a female. She was named Eliza Mellon Swain. We were christened in a hospital rather than in a church, and we were not surrounded by relatives and our parents' friends. The thing was, Eliza and I were so ugly that our parents were ashamed. We were monsters, and we were not expected to live very long. We had 6 fingers on each little hand, and 6 toes on each little footsie. We had supernumerary nipples as well, 2 of them apiece. We were not Mongolian idiots, although we had the coarse black hair typical of Mongoloids. We were something new. We were Neanderthaloids. We had the features of adult fossil human beings even in infancy. Massive brow bridges, sloping foreheads, and steam shovel jaws. We were supposed to have no intelligence and to die before we were 14. But I am still alive and kicking, thank you. And Eliza would be too, I'm certain, if she had not been killed at the age of 50 in an avalanche on the outskirts of the Chinese colony on the planet Mars. Hi-ho. Our parents were two silly and pretty and very young people named Caleb Mellon Swain and Letitia Vanderbilt Swain, née Rockefeller. They were fabulously well-to-do and descended from Americans who had all but wrecked the planet with a form of idiot's delight, obsessively turning money into power, and then power back into money again, and then money back into power again. But Caleb and Letitia were harmless themselves. Father was very good at backgammon, and so-so at color photography, they say. Mother was active in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Neither worked. Neither was a college graduate, though both had tried. They wrote and spoke nicely. They adored each other. They were humble about having done so poorly in schools. They were kind. And I cannot fault them for being shattered by having given birth to monsters. Anyone would have been shattered by giving birth to Eliza and me. And Caleb and Letitia were at least as good at parenting as I was when my turn rolled around. I was wholly indifferent to my own children, although they were normal in every way. Perhaps I would have been more entertained by my children if they had been monsters, like Eliza and me. Hi-ho. Young Caleb and Letitia were advised not to break their hearts and risk their furniture by attempting to raise Eliza and me in Turtle Bay. We were no more true relatives of theirs, their advisor said, than baby crocodiles. Caleb and Letitia's response was humane. It was also expensive and gothic in the extreme. Our parents did not hide us in a private hospital for cases such as ours. They entombed us instead in a spooky old mansion which they had inherited in the midst of 200 acres of apple trees on a mountaintop near the hamlet of Galen, Vermont. No one had lived there for 30 years. Carpenters and electricians and plumbers were brought in to turn it into a sort of paradise for Eliza and me. Thick rubber padding was put under all the wall-to-wall carpets, so we would not hurt ourselves in case we fell. Our dining room was lined with tile, and there were drains on the floor, so we and the room could be hosed off after every meal. More important, perhaps, were 2 chain-link fences which went up. They were topped with barbed wire. The first enclosed the orchard. The second separated the mansion from the prying eyes of the workmen who had to be let in through the first from time to time in order to look after the apple trees. Hi-ho! A staff was recruited from the neighborhood. There was a cook. There were 2 cleaning women and a cleaning man. There were 2 practical nurses who fed us and dressed us and undressed us and bathed us. The one I remember best is Withers Witherspoon, a combination guard, chauffeur, and handyman. His mother was a Withers. His father was a Witherspoon. Yes, and these were simple country people who, with the exception of Withers Witherspoon, who had been a soldier, had never been outside Vermont. They had rarely ventured more than 10 miles from Galen, for that matter. And they were necessarily all related to one another, as inbred as Eskimos. They were, of course, distantly related to Eliza and me, too, since our Vermont ancestors had once been content to dog paddle endlessly, so to speak, in the same tiny genetic pool. But, in the American scheme of things at the time, they were related to our family as carp were related to eagles, say, for our family had evolved into world travelers and multimillionaires. Hi-ho. Yes, and it was easy for our parents to buy the fealty of those living fossils from the family past. They were given modest salaries which seemed enormous to them, since the money-making lobes of their brains were so primitive. They were given pleasant apartments in the mansion and color television sets. They were encouraged to eat like emperors, charging whatever they liked to our parents. They had very little work to do. Better still, they did not have to think much for themselves. They were placed under the command of a young general practitioner who lived in the hamlet, Dr. Stuart Rawlings Mott, who would look in on us every day. Dr. Mott was a Texan, incidentally, a melancholy and private young man. To this day, I do not know what induced him to move so far away from his people and his birthplace to practice medicine in an Eskimo settlement in Vermont. As a curious footnote in history, and a probably meaningless one, the grandson of Dr. Mott would become the King of Michigan during my second term as President of the United States. I must hiccup again. Hi-ho. I swear, if I live to complete this autobiography, I will go through it again, and cross out all the hi-hos. Hi-ho. Yes, and there was an automatic sprinkler system in the mansion, and burglar alarms on the windows and doors and skylights. When we grew older and uglier and capable of breaking arms or tearing heads off, a great gong was installed in the kitchen. This was connected to cherry red push buttons in every room, and at regular intervals down every corridor. The buttons glowed in the dark. A button was to be pushed only if Eliza and I began to toy with murder. Hi-ho. 3. Father to Galen with a lawyer and a physician and an architect, to oversee the refurbishing of the mansion for Eliza and me, and the hiring of the servants and Dr. Mott. Mother remained here in Manhattan, in their townhouse in Turtle Bay. Turtles, in great profusion incidentally, have returned to Turtle Bay. Vera Chipmunk 5 Zappa's slaves like to catch them for soup. Hi-ho. It was one of the few occasions, except for Father's death, when Mother and Father were separated for more than a day or two, and Father wrote a graceful letter to Mother from Vermont, which I found in Mother's bedside table after Mother died. It may have been the whole of their correspondence by mail. "My dearest Tish," he wrote, "our children will be very happy here. We can be proud. Our architect can be proud. The workmen can be proud. However short our children's lives may be, we will have given them the gifts of dignity and happiness. We have created a delightful asteroid for them, a little world with only one mansion on it, and otherwise covered with apple trees." Then he returned to an asteroid of his own, in Turtle Bay. He and Mother thereafter, again on the advice of physicians, would visit us once a year, and always on our birthday. Their brownstone still stands, and it is snug and weather-tight. It is there that our nearest neighbor, Vera Chipmunk 5 Zappa, now quarters her slaves. And when Eliza and Wilbur die and go to heaven at last, our father's letter went on, we can lay them to rest among their Swain ancestors in the private family cemetery out under the apple trees. Hi-ho. As for who was already buried in that cemetery, which was separated from the mansion by a fence, they were mostly Vermont apple farmers and their mates and offspring, people of no distinction. Many of them were no doubt nearly as illiterate and ignorant as Melody and Isidore. That is to say, they were innocent great apes, with limited means for doing mischief, which, in my opinion, as an old man, is all that human beings were ever meant to be. Many of the tombstones in the cemetery had sunk out of sight or capsized. Weather had dimmed the epitaphs of those which still stood. But there was one tremendous monument, with thick granite walls, a slate roof, and great doors, which would clearly last past Judgment Day. It was the mausoleum of the founder of the family's fortune and the builder of our mansion, Professor Elihu Roosevelt Swain. Professor Swain was by far the most intelligent of all our known ancestors, I would say. Rockefellers, DuPonts, Mellons, Vanderbilts, Dodges, and all. He took a master's degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at the age of 18, and went on to set up the Department of Civil Engineering at Cornell University at the age of 22. By that time, he already had several important patents on railroad bridges and safety devices, which alone would soon have made him a millionaire. But he was not content, so he created the Swain Bridge Company, which designed and supervised the construction of half the railroad bridges in the entire planet. He was a citizen of the world. He spoke many languages, and was the personal friend of many heads of state. But when it came time to build a palace of his own, he placed it among his ignorant ancestors' apple trees. And he was the only person who loved that barbarous pile until Eliza and I came along. We were so happy there. And Eliza and I shared a secret with Professor Swain, even though he had been dead for half a century. The servants didn't know it, our parents didn't know it, and the workmen who refurbished the place never suspected it, apparently, although they must have punched pipes and wires and heating ducts through all sorts of puzzling spaces. This was the secret. There was a mansion concealed within the mansion. It could be entered through trapdoors and sliding panels. It consisted of secret staircases and listening posts with peepholes and secret passageways. There were tunnels, too. It was actually possible for Eliza and me, for example, to vanish into a huge grandfather clock in the ballroom at the top of the northernmost tower, and to emerge almost a kilometer away through a trap door in the floor of the mausoleum of Professor Elihu Roosevelt Swain. We shared another secret with the professor, too, which we learned from going through some of his papers in the mansion. His middle name hadn't actually been Roosevelt. He had given himself that middle name in order to seem more aristocratic when he enrolled as a student at MIT. His name on his baptismal certificate was Elihu Witherspoon Swain. It was from his example, I suppose, that Eliza and I got the idea, eventually, of giving simply everybody new middle names. 4. When Professor Swain died, he was so fat that I do not see how he could have fitted into any of his secret passageways. They were very narrow. Eliza and I were able to fit into them, however, even when we were 2 meters tall, because the ceilings were so high. Yes, and Professor Swain died of his fatness in the mansion, at a dinner he gave in honor of Samuel Leghorn Clemens and Thomas Alva Edison. Those were the days. Eliza and I found the menu. It began with turtle soup. Our servants would tell each other now and then that the mansion was haunted. They heard sneezing and cackling in the walls, and the creaking of stairways where there were no stairways, and the opening and shutting of doors where there were no doors. Hi-ho! It would be exciting for me to cry out, as a crazed old centenarian in the ruins of Manhattan, that Eliza and I were subjected to acts of unspeakable cruelty in that spooky old house. But we may have in fact been the 2 happiest children that history had so far known. That ecstasy would not end until our 15th year. Think of that. Yes, and when I became a pediatrician, practicing rural medicine in the mansion where I was raised, I often told myself about this childish patient or that one, remembering my own childhood. This person has just arrived on this planet, knows nothing about it, has no standards by which to judge it. This person does not care what it becomes. It is eager to become absolutely anything it is supposed to be. That surely describes the state of mind of Eliza and me when we were very young, and all the information we received about the planet we were on indicated that idiots were lovely things to be. So, we cultivated idiocy. We refused to speak coherently in public. Buh and duh, we said. We drooled and rolled our eyes. We farted and laughed. We ate library paste. Hi-ho. Consider, we were at the center of the lives of those who cared for us. They could be heroically Christian in their own eyes only if Eliza and I remained helpless and vile. If we became openly wise and self-reliant, they would become our drab and inferior assistants. If we became capable of going out into the world, they might lose their apartments, their color televisions, their illusions of being sorts of doctors and nurses, and their high-paying jobs. So, from the very first, and without quite knowing what they were doing, I am sure, they begged us 1,000 times a day to go on being helpless and vile. There was only one small advancement they wished us to make up the ladder of human achievements. They hoped with all their hearts that we would become toilet-trained. Again, we were glad to comply. But we could secretly read and write English by the time we were 4. We could read and write French, German, Italian, Latin, and ancient Greek by the time we were 7, and do calculus too. There were thousands of books in the mansion. By the time we were 10, we had read them all by candlelight, at nap time or after bedtime, in secret passageways, or often in the mausoleum of Elihu Roosevelt Swain. But we continued to drool and babble and so on whenever grown-ups were around. It was fun. We did not itch to display our intelligence in public. We did not think of intelligence as being useful or attractive in any way. We thought of it as being simply one more example of our freakishness, like our extra nipples and fingers and toes. And we may have been right about that, you know? Hi-ho. 5. And meanwhile, the strange young Dr. Stuart Rawlings Mott weighed us and measured us and peered into our orifices and took samples of our urine day after day after day. "How is everybody today?" he would say. We would tell him blah and duh and so on. We called him Flockabutt. And we ourselves did all we could to make each day exactly like the one before. Whenever Flockabutt congratulated us on our healthy appetites and regular bowel movements, for example, I would invariably stick my thumbs in my ears and waggle my fingers, and Eliza would hoist her skirt and snap the elastic at the waist of her pantyhose. Eliza and I believed then what I believe even now, that life can be painless, provided that there is sufficient peacefulness for a dozen or so rituals to be repeated simply endlessly. Life, ideally, I think, should be like the minuet, or the Virginia reel, or the turkey trot, something easily mastered in a dancing school. I teeter even now between thinking that Dr. Mott loved Eliza and me, and knew how smart we were and wished to protect us from the cruelties of the outside world, and thinking that he was comatose. After Mother died, I discovered that the linen chest at the foot of her bed was crammed with packets of Dr. Mott's bi-weekly reports on the health of Eliza and me. He told of the ever greater quantities of food being consumed and then excreted. He spoke, too, of our unflagging cheerfulness and our natural resistance to common diseases of childhood. The sorts of things he reported, in fact, were the sorts of things a carpenter's helper would have had no trouble detecting, such as that, at the age of 9, Eliza and I were over 2 meters tall. No matter how large Eliza and I became, though, one figure remained constant in his reports. Our mental age was between 2 and 3. Hi-ho. Flockabutt, along with my sister, of course, is one of the few people I am really hungry to see in the afterlife. I am dying to ask him what he really thought of us as children, how much he suspected, how much he really knew. Eliza and I must have given him thousands of clues as to our intelligence. We weren't the cleverest of deceivers. We were only children, after all. It seems probable to me that when we babbled in his presence, we used words from some foreign language which he could recognize. He may have gone into the library of the mansion, which was of no interest to the servants, and found the books somehow disturbed. He may have discovered the secret passageways himself, through some accident. He used to wander around the house a great deal after he was through with us, I know, explaining to the servants that his father was an architect. He may have actually gone into the secret passageways and found books we were reading in there, and seen that the floors were spattered with candle wax. Who knows? I would like to know, too, what his secret sorrow was. Eliza and I, when we were young, were so wrapped up in each other that we rarely noticed the emotional condition of anybody else. But we were surely impressed by Dr. Mott's sadness, so it must have been profound. I once asked his grandson, the King of Michigan, Stuart Oriole II Mott, if he had any idea why Dr. Mott had found life to be such a crushing affair. Gravity hadn't yet turned mean, I said. The sky had not yet turned from blue to yellow, never to be blue again. The planet's natural resources had yet to come to an end. The country had not yet been depopulated by Albanian flu and the Green Death. Your grandfather had a nice little car, and a nice little house, and a nice little practice, and a nice little wife, and a nice little child, I said to the king. And yet he used to mope so. My interview with the king took place, incidentally, in his palace on Lake Maxinkuckee, in northern Indiana, where Culver Military Academy had once stood. I was still nominally the President of the United States of America, but I had lost control of everything. There wasn't any Congress anymore, or any system of federal courts, or any treasury or army or any of that. There were probably only 800 people left in all of Washington, D.C. I was down to one employee when I paid my respects to the king. Hi-ho. He asked me if I regarded him as an enemy, and I said, "Heavens, no, Your Highness. I am delighted that someone of your caliber has brought law and order to the Middle West." He grew impatient with me when I pressured him to tell me more about his grandfather, Dr. Mott. "Christ," he said, "what American knows anything about his grandparents?" He was a skinny and supple and ascetic young soldier saint in those days. My granddaughter, Melody, would come to know him when he was an obscene voluptuary, a fat old man in robes encrusted with precious stones. He was wearing a simple soldier's tunic without any badges of rank when I met him. As for my own costume, it was appropriately clownish. A top hat, a claw-hammer coat and striped pants, a pearl gray vest with matching spats, a soiled white shirt and a choke collar with tie. The belly of my vest was festooned with a gold watch chain, which had belonged to John D. Rockefeller, the ancestor of mine who had founded Standard Oil. Dangling from the watch chain were my Phi Beta Kappa key from Harvard and a miniature plastic daffodil. My middle name had by then been legally changed from Rockefeller to Daffodil-11. "There were no murders or embezzlements or suicides or drinking problems or drug problems in Dr. Mott's branch of the family," the king went on, "as far as I know." He was 30. I was 79. "Maybe grandfather was just one of those people who was born unhappy," he said. "Did you ever think of that?"